Hi, welcome to Café with Cavanha. Today we have Chris Desan from FTIconsulting. Chris is in Houston now. We are in Rio de Janeiro. We invited him to talk about managing risks while investing in Brazil, including the oil and gas industry. Welcome, Chris. Good morning.
Good morning, Cavanha. Bom dia, and very good to be here. I'm glad, we've been trying to do this for some time, and so I'm very glad we're.
That's right. Finally, we are here again. Good.
We are, despite technology challenges.
Could you please tell a little bit us your position, the company, and what the company does?
Sure. Yeah, I'm a managing director within what's known as the Global Risk Investigations practice at FTIconsulting. So FTI is a global management consulting firm. We work in a number of different areas. Everything you can kind of think about what we do in two pieces. One, kind of proactive advisory work, and so there are folks here who work on process improvement. They work on risk management, folks like myself in terms of what I would say kind of corporate advisory on the one hand. And then the thing that FTI historically has been most known for is actually reactive work. And so we have been on most, if not all, in some capacity, the major pieces of litigation in the United States. So as expert witnesses, we've been involved in many, many crises, managing different aspects of the crisis, everything from communications to, for example, in my case, running large-scale investigation. And so the company as a whole, very international, 36 offices around the world, but even I think our offices don't do justice to kind of how global we are. We have people all over.
Okay.
Everything from West Africa to obviously, in your case, near and dear, Brazil. And so very active in Brazil. We have a big team in Brazil working on kind of all aspects of our business. So very, very, I think, interesting company that's been, we've been in kind of numerous kind of behind the headlines in a number of cases that I'm sure you're familiar with, particularly in Brazil.
Chris, how investors currently are viewing Brazil? I mean, in terms of risks, what are the main factors they are considering to come or not to come to Brazil?
Yeah, I think, thank you for the question, because it's kind of near and dear to the work that my team and practice kind of work on. And if you think about the kind of current risk environment, a good friend and professor at American University, I think you'll appreciate this, kind of from an academic standpoint, has talked about the current scenario in Brazil as being affected by a triple crisis. And so that triple crisis is kind of made up of an economic crisis with a political crisis, and then leading it into and related to that, a legal crisis. So we think about it in those three buckets, all of which interact with one another, right? Because the political crisis leads to economic instability and lack of, say, economic governance, and then behind all of those things, you have a major corruption, talent crisis in Brazil. That creates kind of a legal problem. So all of those things kind of interreact and create an interesting scenario for the current environment in Brazil from a risk management standpoint, especially as it pertains to this election, right? So you have this in the background. So just to touch on each of those points just a little bit. So in the economic crisis, obviously Brazil has, you would know better than I would, lackluster growth, relatively high unemployment for Brazil, which has been kind of, it's ticked up and then it's kind of petering out, and now it's kind of ticking up a little bit again. You have economic kind of stagnation from a looming potential pension crisis, right? That no one has yet been able to fully deal with, and then that leads to the other point, which is the political risk aspect to this, which is, you know, everyone thought post-impeachment that, say, Temer would be able to potentially deal with, say, pension reform and the economic crisis. And initially, I think there was a lot of hope that that was going to happen. Then Temer himself, speaking of how these things kind of interact, with he had his own obviously corruption slash political risk challenges, then it resulted in him not being able to put together the kind of coalition that one was hoping initially. And so now you have a president who's as you know, very popular in Brazil and hasn't really been able to do some of the economic movement I think foreign investors were hoping for. And so where does that lead us to today? Well, we have one of the most important elections, you know, coming up in I potentially since the return to democracy. You know, certainly since the Cavanha in '94. You know, the exchange rate is, I think, today perhaps the lowest it's been since. And so I think we're in a very interesting scenario going into the election. So for example, FTI, we get a lot of questions from investors and companies about how we're viewing the elections going forward. And this election, boy, we have a lot of interesting things, right? For somebody like me who's a political junkie on Brazil, this is an interesting election. You have a president, former president who's in jail, who's obviously appealing his convictions with the High Court and the Supreme Court. You have the Electoral Court who just recently said, no, he can't run. On the one hand, that was already making things exciting. And then you have, you know, very unfortunately, you have the stabbing of the other frontrunner in the election who's now running a campaign from the hospital, basically. And so for folks like myself, you know, it's a very interesting time. I think there's a lot of uncertainty. So frankly, I think bank investors are kind of sitting and waiting. But everything is very fluid as it stands. Very, very time.
Is it too much different from other countries in Latin America, or similar to others?
You know, I think it's a great question. Brazil, you know, there are different people with different views about Latin America, and there are those who kind of see Latin America as a whole, right, and kind of lump them all together. There are those who think that Brazil's kind of unique, right, in terms of its history, obviously Portuguese ancestry, language, you know, even just kind of culturally. And then its history with slavery, other things like that, make it particularly unique. I guess I'm in the camp of thinking certainly there are similarities with the rest of Latin America. One could look at, you know, Mexico and elsewhere, but frankly, I think Brazil is very different. So I wouldn't lump things together. People have historically, from a political standpoint, have talked about, you know, the pink tide in Brazil that was kind of led by frankly Lula and Pete, and so in one sense, you know, it does seem during, you know, commodities kind of super cycle, high commodities prices, you got a lot of leftist, center-left pragmatic governments that came to power kind of throughout the region. So if you think of somebody like Cavanha and Peru, who frankly said that he was basing his model off of the Lula Brazil model, you know, state-led capitalist model. You know, there are similarities, I think, but I do think things are quite different. If you look at, for example, the Amazon's election, right? That's very different. So on one hand, you know, on the one hand, you have someone who's you know, a leftist candidate who comes to power in Mexico, who was surprising folks. In Brazil, you have for the first time a quote right-wing candidate who's doing a lot better than many folks would have expected. And so it's I think a very fluid and interesting time. If there's one thing that seems, you know, I guess there's one theme, which it feels like uncertainty. And we can even talk about what is AMLO going to do. I don't know. It's an interesting question in Mexico, for example, what AMLO is going to do on corruption. He ran on an anti-corruption campaign, And so there are lots of questions that we have as to will Lava Jato, for example, which as you know has spread all throughout Latin America in terms of the cooperation between civil and a lot of these other countries, because companies like Odebrecht and others were involved in at least implicated in corruption allegations all over the region. And so,
yeah, but Chris, let me interrupt you, but corruption is not the unique, let's say, variable to be considered to come or to go to another country. There are more factors to consider now.
Oh, absolutely, and absolutely. And frankly, I don't think it's very, I think, good question. I don't think that investors will make a decision to go or not to go, and nor should they make a decision to go or not to go. So if we talk about, let's just focus on Brazil. I don't think investors should make a decision to go to Brazil based on corruption, right? Frankly, companies, my day job is helping companies manage the risks of corruption in a place like Brazil. And so certainly it's the case. I think that companies and investors should be making decisions off of fundamentals, right? You should be thinking about, is this a good market for your business? Is, looking at the horizon. And then most importantly, what I would say is assessing the risks, having a very good assessment of what is the risk scenario. And one of those risks, as you think about all the different risks a company and investors face, is corruption. And so then you get to, well, should you let that risk have some kind of veto power over any of your decision? I think the answer to that is no. But the reality is you should be developing robust compliance programs and frankly internal controls to deal with it. And practically, we've seen literally thousands of companies that have been very, very successful implementing corruption compliance programs in Brazil and kind of doing the right thing. And so it's certainly not the case, to answer your question, it's certainly not the case that a company should let corruption be the final the final say in terms of whether they're going into a profit. I think we see companies every day working through the issues and managing them effectively.
As a company decide to come to Brazil, and how can you advise them to mitigate risks when they come?
Yeah, that's another very good question. So generally, what I would say, and this is just, I think, a good principle, and that is to conduct risk assessments. Now, you can think about that at kind of a macro level and then at a micro level. So at a macro level, you can think about, people in an MBA standpoint, can think about it at the enterprise risk level. And so every company is going to be different, Cavanha. As you know, every company's got different risk tolerances and different risk exposures. And so one of the things that we do, for example, is conduct an assessment first off. Say, okay, you're deciding to go into Brazil. What are your vulnerabilities specifically in your industry and you as a company? What kind of structure are you going to put in place? Are you going to do a JV partnership? Are you going to go alone? Are you going to
local?
Are you going to partner with a local company? Who are your local advisors? Which local firms? There are so many different aspects to it. But in general, I think you can conceptualize that as being risk assessment based. And so, for example, if you're an oil and gas company and you're an exploration and production company, boy, you're going to be interacting a lot with government officials in Brazil. And you're going to be interacting, as you know, with the Ministério de Minas e Energia, or ANP, and all the other, the National Hydrocarbons Agencies and others. And so there's going to be government interaction. If you're thinking like that, you really do need to pay attention to the potential risks, right? And those are very specific in that scenario. And so you'll have internal controls and processes to mitigate the risk. you're another type of company, for example, that's really not going to be interacting with that level, high level kind of government interaction. Your risks might be more dealing with customs brokers and dealing with local level challenges that are very, 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 very different. So if you're importing lots of goods, for example, you're going to face a different set, and it's going to be different depending on which industry you're in. And so that's a long way to say that what we advise is that companies develop, and this is just a good thing in general, but going into Brazil, tangible, kind of specific risk assessments on the risk on the face. And then to your point, how do you deal with it? Well, you manage it, right? And there are going to be different ways to manage it. Some of them you'll manage through insurance, frankly. Some of those you'll manage through specific internal controls and way you structure your business. Some of them you're going to manage by getting the right advisors, right?
That's right. For sure.
Like you, Cavanha, and others who kind of know the market, and frankly, legal advisors, right? You want the right legal advice, and then you want the right partners in Brazil. Yeah. Frankly, there one thing I'd have to point out, I think having the right partners is really important.
Yeah, very important to right partners. Tell me, Chris, considering your clients at this time in Houston, they are more interested on downstream, upstream, being operators or being only partners? What are the main trends?
Yeah, that's interesting. So just in general, I'd say my particular practice and area of focus really is not only oil and gas kind of focus. We kind of frankly work from everything from IT and tech companies, although based in Houston, but the practice tends to be actually pretty industry agnostic. And so we work in lots of different areas. But within the oil and gas industry, and I just as a caveat here, I'd say this isn't necessarily reflective of what's going on in the market, but it's certainly reflective of my experience. I think you're getting certainly interest on I would say on the upstream side, with different without giving company names and for obvious reasons, but there are certainly companies on the upstream side looking at E&P opportunities. As you know, with the reforms that went through with Temer and oil and gas prices going up, and companies I think are finding Brazil quite attractive. And when you look at offshore plays in the current market, right, you look around the globe and say, well, who's interested in them? As you know, just from a merit, from a substance standpoint, I think investors are very interested in pre-salt, for example. And on the upstream side, that being said, I do see a lot of downstream interest, particularly with some of the discussion about potential privatizations, for example.
And the investment, Petrobras, the investments too. No?
From an investment standpoint, downstream can be very interesting, and so petrochemicals industry, refining, and there's certainly I'm hearing lots of interest in that space. And so again, though, I guess get back to my kind of my first point. I actually think that's an sector and an industry that the presidential elections will actually be pretty meaningful on. Like there are certain things, as you know, in Brazil's coalitional presidential system where the president doesn't have the ability to do much because they have to put together coalitions. So pension reform, for example, what can the president do there if they don't form a coalition? Well, basically nothing. However, on oil and gas, right, we as you know, have very different things coming from candidates, right, in terms of, specific examples. And let me caveat this by saying this is my perspective and not necessarily FTI as a company, but from my perspective, Gomez, for example, is talking about potentially reversing some of the reforms that, as you know, that took place under Temer's watch and post Dilma's impeachment. He's saying everything post impeachment is illegitimate. I don't know if that's rhetorical, and he's going to be more like Lula, and it ends up actually kind of pushing back on that in reality, but he's saying it, right? And so I do think that's meaningful. On the other end of the spectrum, Paulo Guedes, Bolsonaro's economic advisor, who's University of Chicago trained, PhD, I think we'll go the other way, right? So he's talking about privatizing everything. And so
unpredictable. Everything is unpredictable at this time.
Everything is unpredictable, right? Everything is unpredictable. And so to your point about like, what are the opportunities in oil and gas? Boy, there are a ton of opportunities, but I do think that investors right now are looking at what the possibilities are in terms of the next regime, and where they decide to go in terms of the policy.
Probably they are postponing some 3 or 4 months to see who will win this election, and after that can take decisions about that.
I think in general, that's generally true. I will say, Cavanha, I think some people, the uncertainty right now does give companies that are willing to take the risk of getting in at this point a certain advantage, because they're going to get assets for cheap. Like right now, no one knows. So ironically, the uncertainty creates some opportunities, right? Because if you're going to make a prediction, if you have a view of how the election is going to come out, you might come in right now and take advantage of the exchange rate, for example. You and I know what's going to happen if certain, depending on how these things go, the exchange rate could go a lot of different directions, so it is true. I think that companies that have very low risk tolerance are kind of sitting and waiting and looking at how things go. Other companies, I think, that may have and investors that have strong views about how things are potentially going to unfold are taking advantage of the uncertainty. Excellent. And what that's doing for asset prices.
Yeah, good. Excellent, Chris. A very good perspective from investor side. I mean, for Brazilians and for US guys, it's very interesting, your thoughts, and thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Cavanha. And I hope I appreciate the invite. This is great. B, I hope we get to do this again.
Sure, it will be a pleasure. Another time with more people discussing and debating about this thing. Good.
Oh, I think we're gonna have lots to talk about after this election.
Yeah, that's right. I would like to thank Chris Dessa for this nice talking, and Cavanha.Café with Brasil Energia, Petróleo and Ecoa PUC Rio. Thank you, Chris. Have a good day.
Thank you very much. Ciao, ciao.
Ciao, ciao. Bye-bye.